The next topic we're going to cover is going to be database vulnerabilities. And one of the reasons we want to take some time to talk about databases is in nearly any corporate or enterprise style company, you have to have a place to put your information. Information, whether it's customer data, statistical data, it doesn't really matter. You need a place to house that. And fortunately for us hackers, there really aren't but about 3 major database manufacturers out there. So these software vendors create these databases, and they don't always have security in mind. Their goal is for functionality, end user, support, all of these different things that make a client happy, not what makes their product secure. So pretty much all major databases have vulnerabilities, whether it be Oracle, Microsoft SQL, whether it be MySQL, which are really the 3 big players. There are probably dozens of other different smaller businesses in the database business, but your large players are basically Microsoft SQL and Oracle, who recently purchased MySQL. So basically, these database servers, depending on what their purpose will be located either inside the network or possibly, if poorly designed, in the DMZ itself. So the location is definitely going to greatly affect how we access the database, not whether or not we can hack it, because we can hack it whether it's in the network or not, and I'll tell you why later. Oftentimes, these databases are back-ends for web servers or for end-user applications. So one of the common things that you're going to see is to compromise the web server followed by the database server. So there are actually many different methods available to hackers to even bypass the web server and go straight to the database server. So there are a lot of options available for us, and this is kind of the scenario I'm talking about, where even if it's in a protected, hardened network and it's locked down, the database is going to allow access from the application. So if we use the application to hack the database, then we've bypassed all security checks applied to that database. So, great example of utilizing software for something other than it was intended, which is going to be hacking through that web application itself. Now, there are lots of common vulnerabilities here. Misconfiguration of permissions and roles is definitely a huge one. Permissions and roles basically define who gets access to what and how in a database environment. As you can imagine, if you incorrectly configure this, then you're opening yourself up to anyone with any account to gain access to sensitive information. Another great example of this is badly constructed database objects. These are going to include the tables, the manipulation language statements, and the definition language statements. And these are basically fancy ways to say how we create our objects. And an object can be anything from a table to a view to a database itself or to a user account. And how we design the interaction of that as database engineers dictates whether or not attackers are going to try to bypass our security mechanisms. Probably one of the single most common ways of hacking databases is through SQL injection. And this basically utilizes an application on the front end, whether it be a desktop or a web application is irrelevant, but we try to manipulate the strings that are being sent to the database. And this actually breaks 2 different massive rules. The first is data validation. Data validation is one of those things where you're only wanting a certain thing to be passed into the application. If you change that, then the application should stop you and should let you know that that's not valid data. A lot of applications don't do that. And basically what will happen here is we'll send in that invalid data, which ultimately is a SQL statement that can be read by the SQL server. We send it to the application parses it, doesn't say anything, and then sends it to the database. And if the database doesn't have restrictions on how the application can send requests to it, it will actually parse that and return back whatever your request was. So with a limited knowledge of applications and how they interact with databases, and a little bit more knowledge of structured query language, you can exploit pretty much any system with a correctly formed select statement. Another very common database vulnerability are the database passwords that get left unchanged. If you actually go through and accept the defaults on the entire installation of Microsoft SQL 2000, the SA password will be blank, which is the system administrator account. So effectively you could gain root permissions on the remote system by simply not supplying a password. And probably the single most critical thing, and I've kind of hinted at this and maybe touched on it throughout our conversations about database vulnerabilities, is that the application that they serve is probably going to be their downfall. Databases almost have to open themselves up to that application. And that application pretty much has across-the-board permissions to whatever they need. And again, this is up to the database and application designer, but the application is where the vulnerabilities generally start. Now, there are some existing vulnerabilities in the database software, but the application is where we should spend most of our time if we're looking for a vulnerability or a method for exploitation.